Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I'm Gemma Files, and this is No
No
Darkness But
darkness
Ours.
but ours.
High five through the screen to
Yes,
England. From Canada to England.
that's the good hands across the ocean, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So
Um,
here we are again.
yes,
Uh,
having at least one episode under our belts, our mutual belt, I guess. It's like one long belt.
belts across the ocean now.
That's it. Yeah, circumnavigating the globe. Yeah, circumcising the globe with
I
an
was just going to say that.
11-foot flipper. So, having at least one episode under our mutual belt, we are moving on to episode number 2.
Yeah.
And the topic that we chose for this week is M.R. James.
Yep. And
Montague Rhodes James.
and his influence, and which is a big, his imitators. I mean, it's a big and fruitful topic. I think, as in like the one we picked last week, it's one of these things where by the time we'll get to the end of it, we'll probably think of a dozen authors or things that we could have been discussing, and there will always be more, but that's always a good
Absolutely.
thing.
I do think that, I was answering a few questions today because I'm going to be going to Necronomicon in August, and they wanted me to do a little mini interview for the Memento book. And one of the questions was, what was your entree into weird fiction, weird as in Lovecraftian fiction? And I had to think about it because although obviously I'd come across some Lovecraft earlier in my life, by the time I actually started writing Lovecraftian fiction, I kind of had to take a crash course because I was far more I was far more familiar with people who had been influenced by Lovecraft than I was with Lovecraft himself.
Yeah.
T.E.D. Klein, or even Stephen King, some of his early stuff, like for example the story Jerusalem's Lot, which was recently made into a really, really nice TV miniseries, which manages to be about vampires and Lovecraftian at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Chapelwaite was made into this TV miniseries called Chapelwaite with Adrian Brody. And at one point, Christopher Heyerdahl, who's this very familiar looking guy, if you know anything about Canadian film, because he is this gigantic dude, this gigantic bald dude, who pretty much looks like, I don't know, a cross between Max Schreck and Christopher Lee.
Okay.
And he's always playing vampires and ghouls and zombies and, whatever the hell. And so he shows up in Chapelwaite as Jacob, who is like the head vampire, leads this weird little Mansonite crew of, aspiring vampires and actual vampires. A whole bunch of Renfields who are, allowing themselves to be preyed on. But they also worship the worm, the god of the worm, and they're like looking to make the sun go out and eternal night descend in a very cosmic horror Lovecraftian way.
And you can see why they'd want the eternal night to descend.
Exactly, because they're vampires. But there's this wonderful moment where he gets a hold of the book that they've all been looking for, which is, of course, De Vermis Mysteriis. Of course. And he begins to read out of it, but he's not reading, he's actually singing. And Heyerdahl, because he, comes from like a Scandinavian background, I don't think he has an actual accent like that in real life, but you know. So he starts doing this thing that sounds kind of like Scandinavian plain song, but it's all stuff like
Oh man, that sounds cool.
oh, it's amazing. Yeah, it's
I'm
absolutely.
gonna see if I can find
Yeah,
that.
you absolutely should. Yeah, very, very well done. Just a mounting sense of dread, which is always what I like. A mounting sense of dread, and I'm happy.
Oh yes, I mean, I'm actually realizing I came to discover James's work really comparatively late in the day.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had read Lost Hearts in an anthology of ghost stories when I was quite young, but without realizing that's who it was by or who.
My first one was Lost Hearts too. It's
Lost
interesting
Hearts 2,
because
you did a sequel.
no, no. No, I mean my first M.R. James was Lost Hearts as well.
Yeah.
I think it's something that they put in a lot of things for kids or I don't know, like tweens maybe, because the main character is a kid.
Yeah. Yeah, which isn't that common in James's stuff, with the possible exception of Wailing Well.
Yes,
Which
absolutely. Which is not what I would start with because it's kind of considerably more funny than you
yeah.
than you grow to expect.
Yeah, until the sort of the climax when it's kind of like, oh no, he's absolutely.
That's really bad. That's terrible.
There's
Yeah,
a
Montague.
whole stuff to be had about the humour though in that story, because it is quite an ominous, slightly menacing humour because of how, there's that whole black humour of the life-saving competition, and the teachers are upset because all these kids have. But not so much because the kids have drowned, but because they've lost some of the best sopranos in the choir, and the parents aren't happy with the form letters that they're being sent and stuff like that.
It's like yeah. I mean, it is very much like the inverse of a school story. It's like a story you tell to school kids to make them laugh, but also to eventually make their flesh creep.
Oh yeah.
Old Dickensian sense.
I
just want to make your flesh creep,
But there's that recognition of the power that the teachers kind of have over it's that child. And of course, again, this was a boarding school, which is something that is something outside my experience. I presume outside yours as well. You're sort of away from your family. You're in that very. I mean, my sister lives in New Zealand, and her daughter, my eldest nibbling, her daughter's going to, is now at a boarding school because basically she has to be. I think that's the nearest kind of school she can get to.
Right.
She has to live there. But of course, I think it's a very different thing. And of course, there's stuff like Skype. The English boarding school has that, is notorious for its kind of, very, very repressed kind of Englishness.
When I was in middle school, I read a whole bunch of Enid Blyton school books back to back, which are all about how wonderful it is to go to a girls' boarding school. And as far as I could tell, it was supposed to be wonderful because you'd get the crap kicked out of you socially. I mean, nobody actually got beaten, but it was all like, and you have to be my servant, and you must curb your, you have to curb your bad habits, like your ambition or your wanting to get really good marks but only in one thing, or your lack of enthusiasm for being at a fucking English boarding school.
There would have been an outbreak of deaths by poisoning, I suspect, if you'd actually had to go to one of those places.
Yeah. Kill or be killed. Kill or kill yourself. Yes, no, I shouldn't say things like that. But it might have. Yeah,
it can be very dull. It can be a very. I mean, it's easy to. I mean, there's that Ray Bradbury. Do you know the Ray Bradbury story, The Playground? About the father who ultimately really, he's so appalled by the prospect of his beloved little son, who's a very sort of delicate, very gentle child, being put into the kind of the Darwinian melee of a playground. He ultimately changes places with them, with him. And there's the last lines of "This is hell," and no one in that hot milling heap contradicted him. You kind of wonder how many of these little monsters are all people doing the same thing with their kids.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was, because I was lucky. I was fairly precocious in my reading, for the most part. I mean, I think I've said this before. My grandfather had a huge, thick 1929 anthology of horror. So there was Blackwood, there was Bierce, there was Poe. I read the Mask of the Red Death, I think, when I was about 7 or 8. Hell of an introduction. But weirdly, there was no M.R. James in there. No Lovecraft either. I didn't discover Lovecraft until I was in secondary school. There was a copy of The Haunted of the Dark in the library, and I knew of Lovecraft mainly by reputation then. And I don't think it made that big an impression on me. Maybe because I was, Lovecraft was a writer who made a virtue out of his shortcomings, like his weakness when it came to characterization and dialogue in the normal sense. So I don't know if although I did of course enjoy The Rats in the Walls, especially when it gets to the end and that kind of long that his speech is devolving into blah, blah, blah. That is what they tell me I was saying when they found, and it's like, you just imagine somebody is there somebody there with an open, so how do you spell blah?
I think actually The Rats in the Walls might have been the one that made the most impression on me back when. Yeah. Because I had 2 collections. One was collected Lovecraft, and the other one was collected Arthur Machen. And I ended up liking Machen a lot better than I did Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Machen. I don't know which one is right. I think it's Machen.
It's certainly pronounced as Machen in The Fog, because of course they have John Houseman's little cameo as Mr. Machen.
That's right.
Tells some ghost stories. But certainly in the UK, when other people, I've been hearing other people discuss it, they tend to say it as Machen. I don't know if this is an American thing or a North American thing, Machen. I have no idea. There's probably, Google is probably our friend here. We'd probably be able to maybe find
quite probably. I will note that the Weird Studies podcast, which I would recommend to anybody, they refer to him as Machen, and they've had I think about 3 different episodes that address various issues in Machen's, sort of numinous philosophy / theory of the supernatural. The idea, for example, of evil being a sort of ecstasy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that there is very little difference between sinners and saints.
Yes. Yeah. That's sort of his nature of his conception of what sin is, what actually constitutes sin, which is very much at odds with the humanistic sort of.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, it really seems to be like, to go against nature, to go against, to be like, yes, I'm gonna have my cat talk. I'm gonna make a rose that sings.
Yeah.
I, a rose, am going to sing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a profoundly reactionary sort of view, because of course it's the time-honored kind of almost the mantra whenever anyone has tried to, whether it be abolishing slavery or whatever, or votes for women, there is a natural. If you've seen the film of Cloud Atlas,
that's right.
Hugo Weaving's character always appears as the kind of the personification of
there is a natural order to things,
and those who try to append it do not fare well. Yeah, and
of course not.
We all hear that. We all hear that claim made in one form or another, but of course it all depends. But I mean, of course, when he talks about the dog talking, I mean, of course, by the time I read that bit, I'd been quite used to reading books by Jonathan Carroll, which are full of talking dogs, and the talking dogs are really cool. What's wrong with a dog talking to?
Probably a rose or 2 singing. I can never get over the fact that Carroll once wrote a story in which the main character turns out to be death. It's like your narrator. It's like, and then of course I just did this and this and this because I'm deaf. there you go. It's like, what? All right. So
Yes.
so that's what we're gonna do, huh? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, again, Mackin and Carol are probably both worthy of a whole podcast to themselves.
Oh, absolutely. No, yeah, Macon and Carol are definitely both
Yeah.
worthy of that. Okay, so like I said, I approached M.R. James more through people who had been influenced by M.R.
Yeah.
James, and then eventually ended up, falling headfirst into a pile of haunted bedrolls, and suddenly going, "Oh my God, this guy's great!
Yes.
This guy's amazing." More than anything else, when I was first reading horror, it was pretty much all ghost stories.
Yeah.
And what attracted me to James is that his stuff will seem very kind of soft and kind of stiff and kind of British and kind of, let's face it, this is a guy who enjoyed boarding school so much that he stayed there the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Eventually ending up as, a dean.
Yeah. Yeah. He definitely that sort of that kind of cloistered atmosphere.
Yeah, very cloistered atmosphere. I mean, he's a guy who came out of, a background which was very much Church of England and, very much academic. And it's like, you go into the church, you go into academics, he sort of did both again because he went into religious studies and,
so a very cerebral, very sort of rationalistic kind of thing. And then
and yet totally devout. So already there's this superstition, there's this religiosity, there's this sense of good and evil as just being parts of the world, the two currents that are constantly around you always.
I mean, to the extent to which some degree of rationalism and a belief in God would necessarily be seen as a kind of a contradiction. I don't know if that would have really been the case though for someone of James's generation.
No, he was. I mean, I do think he was a pretty rational dude, but he was very much his idea of religion came from the Middle Ages.
Oh yeah,
he was a medievalist. He was an antiquarian. That's why Ghost Stories of an Antiquarian was his first book, and almost all his narrative characters, almost all his POV characters tend to be versions of himself. So it's like a guy who is on, taking a bicycle tour through Suffolk, going to churches because he likes doing that and, taking rubbings on gravestones. And, it's like, oh, may I look through your church records? Oh, of course. Yes, please come in.
I mean, he's often present in his stories as a narrator. I mean, the warnings to the curious is written very much as if. I mean, certainly, I don't know if the BBC did a number of adaptations around 2000 with. Well, it was basically Christopher Lee playing M.R. James and basically reading his stories to.
Yes, because that's what he wrote the stories to do. He would try to make sure that he always had a ghost story ready for Christmas. And he would invite, various younger dudes that he liked who were students to come to his chambers and, drink sherry and, make wry jokes and then hear a ghost story. And, I mean, there's people go back and forth about whether James was gay and just super closeted. Certainly, I think E.F. Benson was pretty gay. And, the Benson brothers all had their own thing going on.
I was going to ask if he wrote Morris, but that was Ian Forster. I keep getting
that was
mixed
Ian
up.
Forster, yeah. But the Benson brothers and James all knew each other. And I think of the Benson brothers, at least one of them ended up going into the church. I mean, wasn't their father like a bishop or something like that? Yeah.
I honestly cannot remember. I really should have done a bit more research on some of these
No,
guys.
don't worry about it. But the point being that I think that to him, I think that to James, and you certainly see that throughout his stuff, there's a certain homosocial turn to it. He's comfortable with guys. He's not that comfortable with women. Women sort of appear in the background of things.
Yeah.
People don't tend to have wives. People don't tend to have, girlfriends or anything like that. Maybe like they live with an old aunt, who sets out their stuff in the morning or whatever.
Your sister, like in the Stalls of Barchester.
Yeah, exactly. But pretty much always it's a very asexual, cloistered existence where your obsessions don't tend to be overtly sexual in any way, and yet we being who we are, we being the weird moist monkeys that we are, stuff comes out in other ways, and it's not quite as overt as, say, I don't know, Anne Munby's, and then there was like a big hot hairy bag that suddenly attached itself to my face in the dark. It's like, oh, I wonder what that's about.
It's basically teabagged to death by a.
But yeah, he had a certain obsession with spiders, a certain obsession with toads, reaching underneath things and finding mouths surrounded by hair.
Yeah. Freud is just, I can just hear Freud scribbling notes frantically.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I really love about James is that he manages to, he will get you into this very palpable sense of, this is normal. This is a normal person doing normal shit, in a normal world where everything is perfectly normal. And then before you know it, a bolster falls out of a cupboard and fastens its teeth in the neck. And
James's, I mean, this is the thing. James's ghosts are these are not sort of like filmy, diaphanous,
they really are not
kind of shit. They have a physicality to them, and they're very rarely recognizably human, or they're barely human.
I really think they're a lot more like demons. I don't agree with everything that Mark Gatiss posits in his documentary on M.R. James. But I do believe that if you look at the medieval manuscripts that he was examining throughout his life, you will see a lot of things which will remind you of stuff from, not just because, really I think the first story he wrote and published was the scrapbook of Canon Albert's scrapbook. And Canon Albert's scrapbook literally is about a guy who finds a horrible drawing from a medieval manuscript that somebody has cut out and stuck in a scrapbook. And as he's looking at it and going, oh, that's horrible. Oh, it's so hairy, and its jaws so shallow, and oh, those hands like gigantic tarantulas, and oh, it's very much like this thing that's right next to my head. Ah!
I mean, it's that there's that view. There's the rationalistic, humanistic kind of world that James inhabited, and there's the medieval world. The medieval world, I mean, as a very, very simple level, the kind of the humanist world is basically the world. Reality consists solely in what we can perceive with our own five senses, or with extensions of them like scientific instruments. There is no, this is it. This is all there is. Which is, I mean, and I can't remember who said this, but the fundamental concept of all religions, the root of all religions is the idea there is more. This isn't all there is. There is more than that.
Yes, exactly. So,
and the medieval view, the medieval vision of the world, this whole kind of cosmogony where you've got it, basically postulates this whole invisible world of spirits and there's
both when we wake and when we sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Invisible things all around us, and but also, if you look at ghost stories from the Middle Ages, a lot of them, are very, possibly because of overlap from Scandinavian influence, the Anglo-Saxon influence and the Viking influence. But there's this real sense that, it's like if you meet a dead guy on the road, you might have a wrestling match with him. A demon might fall down on you and take you up into the air and then drop you on a church so that you get stuck on the spire. Who knows? It's like things are just as likely to beat the hell out of you as they are to frighten you and leave you to die.
Yeah. And this is just and these are just part of the world that you exist in.
Yes.
Whereas in James, James kind of builds this very, very recognizable foursquare, very very materialistic kind of concept of the world around you, and then something from this medieval landscape, which is essentially the kind of landscape that Arthur Machen implicitly believed we still existed in.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, to return to Lost Hearts, for example, I do think that Lost Hearts is probably one of the best places to begin with James. Lost Hearts, our main character arrives at his uncle's. His parents have died. He's an orphan. He arrives at his uncle's house. It's about 1813 or something like that, and he's being taken in, and he's like, oh, so grateful. It's like everybody's so nice to him. Da da da. His uncle's a bit weird. He's a scholar. He apparently is very up on knowledge about the ancient pagan Greeks.
Yeah.
But and he tends to like pop out at various times and ask him how old he is. No, really? You're almost 12. Almost 12. Yes. Will that be in a year? Oh, well, thank you. Yes. Well, we'll have to do something special for you then.
Just not what you had in mind.
Meanwhile, over this year where he's, waiting to, have this special night with his uncle for one reason or another.
That sounds so wrong when you say it.
Sounds extraordinarily wrong. And there is no implication of this except perhaps in my own perverse mind. But no, he hears that there have been at least 2 other children who have been taken into this household, both of whom disappeared. It's like one of them was a guy who played the hurdy-gurdy on the streets, and so he probably ran away. Giovanni was his name, one of them foreign types. And the other one was a girl named Phoebe who was of gypsy extraction. So she was probably taken by the gypsies, taken back with, taken away by them, But they're just not there anymore. And meanwhile, our hero starts to have these dreams where he'll be looking he gets up in the middle of the night and looks out the window, and there are like 2 kids, a girl and a boy, standing, sort of looking up hungrily at the house, or with their long fingernails and their rents in their shirts, where perhaps something has been taken out, and that amazing dream that he has of seeing one of them in a disused bathroom in an old tin bathtub. It's like with its dusty fingers laid against its lips.
Yeah.
And this goes exactly where you think it's going to go, which is, did the uncle do something to these kids? Well, thankfully, he cannot do the same thing to his nephew, because the ghosts, that psychic portion of
As he calls it, yeah.
that he dismisses as having no power over him, as a hermetic magician.
Yeah. I mean, another thing in which Mr. Abney, I mean, certainly in his own, because as we get to the end, he's left the document which basically, here is my fiendish plan, kind of, as it were. But it's kind of
and to him it's not a fiendish plan. To him it's like, well, if you have to do this, then you have to do it. I mean, come on.
He has, but I mean, his mentality towards it is that this is perfectly justified because these people are lesser.
Yes.
In some way, he dislikes using the word victim, or that dislikes the term murdered being used to apply to how Simon Magus was able to fly through the air with the aid of the spirit of a child he'd done in.
He had, in some libelous fashion, murdered.
Yeah, and this is a profoundly anti-Christian point of view.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's why it's said that he specializes in the study of the pagan Greeks, because he's an animist. He's the kind of person who believes that it's perfectly fine to consume other people's lives.
Yeah, if you are of a superior kind of bent, whereas on a Christian level, there's sort of the idea of every human soul is of equal. Every human life, every human soul is of equal importance to God in that particular, in a Christian worldview, in the worldview that we have to assume that James would have, that we presume James would have been in sync with, which, interestingly enough, is kind of like quite the sort of the paganistic, but it's kind of quite interesting. Or go thinking of Machen, how that attitude turns up in the attitude in the Great God Pan, and the attitude of the surgeon.
Yes,
he's basically, I saved Mary, Mary, I think is the girl's name. He operates on from dying. So I believe her life is mine to dispose of as I see fit. I'm pretty sure the law would disagree.
And also she loves him, so she's like, yeah, absolutely.
But the inmost light, which I think are often overlooked back in the story, has a similar thing where the doctor's wife agrees to let him do this operation on her. Of course you can. You're my husband. You can do whatever you like, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's sort of like he takes out her soul. It's sort of like he removes her soul, which somehow is located inside her head. So and it's a crystal, this beautiful crystal. And
I must admit, when I read the title, The Inmost Light, I assumed it was going to be one of Machen's more, sort of gentler, kind of more
let's
more
go towards the inmost light. No, it's like this, it's like, I took out her soul, here it is. Nice, huh?
Yes,
it's too bad she's like a fucking fiend now, but
Yeah, the guy does the autopsy, says that brain was not a human brain, it was the brain of a devil. Yes. Whatever the brain of the devil may actually resemble.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Again, and you're sort of like, how do you know? But it's as though she's become like this horrifying zombie, but like ravenous and awful. And like you get the feeling that she's impossible to be around because she just wants to destroy everything.
Yeah. I mean, when it came, Machen didn't really have any kind of aversion to the idea of just bumping women off, did he?
No.
They treated their lives as quite disposable. I mean, when you think of the end of the Great God Pan, it's like, the guy's got no, it's like, it's never suggested there's anything wrong with this idea that I'm going to be judge, jury, and executioner if necessary. And
well, on the other hand, is Helen a person? She looks like a woman.
Incidentally, if you're not familiar with it, I strongly recommend Roseanne Rabinowitz's novella Helen's Story, which picks up from Helen Vaughan's point of view in the present day, where she basically says, that guy really thought I was just going to go and do myself in just because he said so. I mean, what the fuck? I remember thinking, even at the time when I read it, it's like, okay, so she's this like demonic, this terrifying
creature who can make, people go insane by essentially, as far as I can tell, devolving and then evolving back again.
Presumably when they're on the job with her, perhaps. I don't know. I do remember a discussion with I had with Joel Lane about Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep, and he's speculating on the sex lives of Edward and Asenath, and did she ever flip them round when they were in bed, kind of thing.
I know. Yes, and people now, of course, when they're playing with that part of the Lovecraftian mythos, it's like, let's see how far we can go with that.
Yeah.
Carrie Laban does some great stuff with that in A Hawk in the Woods.
Okay.
Yeah, which is very much based around that particular story.
I'd have to check that out, because I've long had sort of some ideas and some notes jotted down in the back of my brain somewhere for writing a sort of story from Asenath Waite's point of view. But I better make sure I'm not. I haven't been beaten too much to the punch here.
Well, I think there were about 3 people who chose to do Asenath Waite stories for Cthulhu's Daughters. Daughters. Yeah, Cthulhu's Daughters. So, yeah, check it out.
Yes,
it's worth it. At any rate, the point being that
back to James.
Back to James. So we've got this sort of back and forth between the very physical world and the sort of, and people allowing themselves to think, well, we can map the physical world so beautifully and so scientifically now that maybe good and evil don't exist anymore. Maybe there is no good or bad. Maybe there is no, maybe there is no right or wrong. Yeah, more than good or bad, right or wrong. Maybe there is no right or wrong. And then being sort of like bitch slapped by
yes.
And not bitch slapped in a God out of the machine kind of way, because it's not like, God comes down and goes, you just stop doing that. It's more like, no, seriously.
Yeah.
There are things you shouldn't fuck with. There are things you shouldn't look at. There are things you shouldn't do. And I would think that you were smart enough to know this yourself, because you are an academic or an antiquarian or a,
Yes. It kind of goes back to what we were discussing in the first podcast about how a great deal of supernatural fiction involves people crossing a line, somewhere, crossing a boundary.
Absolutely.
And I think I remember reading an essay on James where you could basically, I think it said you could have basically 2 or 3 rules which which the characters usually end up breaking, which is don't meddle with things you don't understand, being one of the I mean, not always, of course. In the case of casting the runes, the main character's only offence has been to say, well, I think this is an absolute load of horseshit, and incur the wrath of an extremely vindictive individual with
an extremely vindictive individual who has himself gone too far.
Yes.
This is the thing, he that particular character, the character from casting the runes, thinks of himself again as a hermetic magician, and it's like the most, it really is like that. It's a holdover from, I don't know, like the late 1600s, the early 1700s, where you had a lot of scientific knowledge suddenly coming up, but people also believed the most heinous bullshit at the same time. And there was no way of telling the heinous bullshit from the scientific knowledge. People still believed in humors. People still believed that, women's wombs bounced around inside their bodies, and,
You're like, this does not happen. This does really
it's
not.
Like, no. So, I mean, and again,
Republicans in America possibly still think they do.
Very beautifully put across this type of sort of pseudoscience, where it's almost like a commingling of magic and science, is very beautifully put across in Nigel Neal's screenplay originally, teleplay originally, and now the BBC has done a wonderful radio adaptation of it with Mark Gatiss, of The Road, where you run up against, a person who is a thoroughgoing scientist, but he's a scientist in the same way that he's a zealot. And then running up against a person who is an absolute rationalist and only believes in what he can see and what he can feel, and then who then sees and feels something that he cannot prove at all. And realizes that the scientific zealotry of the other person is eventually going to lead to this terrible thing happening in the future.
I remember a novel I was working on last year had I was researching characters like John B, the magician, who was actually a scientist and astronomer of some, a mathematician of some note, but also an occultist. But of course, all of these things were areas of study. I mean, if you remember Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus, he's looking at the different sort of areas of science. He's looking at physics, medicine. He's looking at Justinian, which is the law, and then divinity is one of the other subjects.
That's right.
And it's like he goes for magic because that can actually take him beyond what he already, this circumscribed pool of knowledge that we already have. But again, divinity, the study of the stuff, people still took more or less. A lot of people still believe that there was a soul, there was a god, there were angels, there was all sorts of
like
stuff.
The spheres of the universe, and how do they act upon each other, very little difference between astronomy and astrology, for example.
There was a lot of overlap. People were still trying to work stuff out, and when all you've got is, again, you've got what people have concluded in the past, who believed in their own gods and all the rest of it. So you're kind of piecing it together, and it was all this. It was all very much.
So so in a way, James is crossing over into Macan territory here, and basically saying that if you tell yourself that you should be able to use power just because you have it, just because you've mastered it. And therefore, it is up to you to say what's right is that I should use it any way I see fit. And what's wrong is that I should master it and then never use it. Then you are a Macan-like type of sinner. You are going against the natural order of the universe. And even this thing that he wrote. Much later in his life, he wrote a very brief story called "The Malice of Inanimate Objects," which I think actually is something that explains a lot of the charge of James when he really gets going. Because it is all about the malice of inanimate objects. It's not the malice of a sheep or the malice of a flute or the malice of a bag that isn't actually a bag. The malice of a bolster that isn't actually a bolster. Yes, and but a lot of it is also about the malice of a crown. I think I began with
the warnings for the curious.
Exactly.
I mean, with both that and with Count Magnus, there is this thing of there is of the consequences that fall upon the person for their transgression go way above and beyond anything, certainly, and or certainly go above and beyond the sort of the act itself. And most frighteningly, of course, there's no forgiveness for it. Once
what can one do but lock the door and cry to God?
And
God doesn't answer, and that's the interesting thing. You expect that because he's such a religious dude that there will be a lot of it's like I went to a priest and the priest helped me. No, it's actually, you have to think your way out of these things a lot of the time. And sometimes you can't think your way out of these things. And sometimes you're just standing by and watching them happen, as in the mezzotint, which, is just about a mezzotint that changes every time you look away from it. and it tells a little story. And at the end, you know something that you didn't know before, but nothing that you do can alter
Yeah.
the function of the mesotent. You know, it's
Yeah.
like, it's not like you can ever save that child. It's not like you can ever, you know, it's not like you learning what happened, you know, has any real reckoning on anything. It's just, it's just sort of like something reaching out from the past and going, let me transmit the awfulness
Yeah.
of this thing to you. And yeah, now I'm done. You can sell me, or, you know, put me in a closet or something.
I think they burn it, don't they, in the story?
I think they do. Yeah. Yeah. I would burn it. I would definitely burn it. Yeah. It's and it's always stuff like that. It's always stuff like, you know, oh, I found this wallpaper sample, you know.
Yes.
I found this old wallpaper sample in a book that I picked up at a sale, and, you know, my aunt decided that it was such a beautiful pattern she would have new wallpaper made, but the wallpaper was based on dead man's hair.
Yeah. It's just like, yeah, that's a great idea. And fucking hell.
Yeah, and we just get this creepy fucking haunting, which really just goes down to every time I touch the wallpaper, it feels like hair. And it sort of feels more and more like hair. And then I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to get smothered by all this hair. Let's just get rid of the wallpaper, okay?
Yeah.
That's it. That's the whole thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's
all because somebody stole somebody's wig when they were dead. No, somebody stole somebody's hair and made it into a wig when they were dead.
Yes. It is just like that kind of like this. It's a lot of it. Sometimes it is just that kind of chaos, kind of intruding, that without necessarily a great deal of rhyme and reason. I mean, I was thinking a little of some of Burridge's stories, which
A.M.
Burridge, yeah. I mean, very underrated, right? Quite different in many ways from James, but I mean, one thing, because he was a staunch Catholic,
right.
And it comes up in in a few of his stories where they will uncover, you know, the remains of some victim, and it's like, well, there is nothing we can do because the person who caused this has already gone on to their punishment.
That's right.
Nobody can do anything for this child now. Just bury them decently, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of similar to the. It's sort of similar to the Met, well, similar but different to the Metzertent in that respect. That's, yes, you've got this information, but there's fuck all you can do about it.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I guess this is one of the big problems with being an antiquarian, is that you're always discovering stuff that's already happened.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know Robert Westall's collection, Antique Dust. It's one of his only collection of stuff for adult readers, but it's kind of like through the whole premise is it's telling the story through an antique dealer who, by the sheer nature of his job, comes into contact with all these potentially haunted items. There's a wonderful line where he says, "I've known more evil in a set of false teeth than in all the so-called haunted houses in England." But that's a very, very Jamesian collection in most respects. He acknowledged it. He actually dedicated the collection to the memory of M.R. James, that most economical of writers who could coax fear out of an old blanket.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And I don't know, maybe it has something to do with the fact that the stuff that we own and the stuff that we interact with takes on some of our personality, you know.
Yeah.
I do believe that, you know, if I was dead and people came to my condo and were looking around, they could certainly learn a lot about me from the things that I have. You know? I was like, oh, she likes to read scary stories, and she's got this weird little house made of resin over here. And,
I am going to have one of those little bracelets that says, "Please delete my browser history."
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's like, oh, you know, did she paint all these creepy looking?
Yeah, she did.
Yes, she did. Yes. Why do you have why do you have a cup with stars inside of it? Well, but at the same time, yeah, there is this feeling that even that every action that you make, every choice implies a choice, and every choice that you make is either for or against the tide of how things should be. For or against, to some degree, I guess, the force of God. If you believe that, the world is, the physical world is like a manifestation of God, that God is not only made everything, but is in everything, then to some degree, any action that you decide upon, any choice that you make, any act you decide to do, is either cooperating with this world, or and building upon it, or not cooperating with it and destroying part of it.
It's almost like, I remember a friend of mine talking about Taoism, the idea that the universe has a sort of an idea of a flow, a direction in which it goes. Oh, it has basically something. It has there's basically a direction you should be going in, and if you go along with that, you'll be fine, or you'll be better off anyway. But if you go against it, then that will cause problems for you, because you're kind of creating a conflict, and that conflict.
Yeah, and that there is this real sense of balance, and and a sense of justice and injustice. That if wrong is done, then justice should eventually, come to balance that out. And if injustice is practiced, then it invites.
Well, the nature of that justice can. I mean, like I say, in the warning to the curious, even though the guy tries to, Paxton tries to redress what he's done and replace the crown, it's still not enough to save him.
But he knows it's not enough. He knew it, like the second that he indulged his obsession.
Yeah.
And the second that he touched this object of veneration, this old Saxon crown, one of the three crowns of England that are supposed to stay where they are and to protect England from invasion, which is a fascinating idea.
I think entirely James's invention, sadly, as far as I can
tell.
Well,
I seem to recall that Ivar the Boneless supposedly died in England, and he caused himself to be buried upright in his barrow, wherever that was, looking towards the coast, so that if another army came to conquer England, which he considered to be his, he would erupt out of the earth and and do something about it. Although, let's face it, the person who eventually came to conquer England after Ivar was one of his, descended from one of his relatives.
Yes, William the Bastard. William the Bastard.
This is a long conversation, and perhaps we should spare our listeners and break it right here. So, having talked about James-ishness for quite some time, we thought that it would be smart to make a second episode in which we talk about Jamesians, both contemporaries of James, who admired him and were making some effort perhaps to write James-ishness into their own stuff, and more recent writers that in which we find patterns of Jamesianness. So there you are. What did you think? Let us know in the comments below.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please hit the like and share buttons, and you can find us on YouTube, Stitcher, Anchor, and SoundCloud.
And if you want to support the podcast, you can always make a one-off donation over at our Ko-fi page, or subscribe on our Patreon for access to exclusive content and get the heads up on what's coming next. by finding us on Twitter or checking out our website at
nodarknessbutours.wixsite.com/podcast.
Okay. Second in the bag.
Okay, so I have been Simon Bestwick,
And I have been Gemma Files, and this has been No Darkness,
Darkness
but Ours.
Buttours.